Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Levinson. I teach at the law school, and I'm going to talk to you for about 20 to 25 minutes on campaign finance and campaign disinformation, which is really just a nice way of saying campaign lies. So first things first, what is campaign finance? It's the way we finance campaigns. It's money that's given to candidates, money that's spent by candidates, money given to and spent by political committees, by things called PACs, which are political action committees, and by outside groups like corporations, for instance. And so one of the big questions in campaign finance law is there too much influence of money in politics? And you've probably read about or talked to your friends about this idea that money just plays too big of a role in our elections. The question I want to talk to you about today is, does it really play too big a role? How much money is too much? And what should we do about it? What are some of the solutions? And then I want to end by talking about something that's really important, which is campaign disinformation or misinformation. So first things first, let's talk about campaign finance law and money in politics. So a lot of money, it is true, is raised and spent by candidates, particularly now in an election year. So let's talk about the current election. So far, and I apologize, you'll see me looking at my notes a little bit on the side of the screen. President Trump, his candidate committee, meaning he himself, not outside groups, have raised almost $343 million. Outside groups have raised about $100 million, or excuse me, outside groups have raised about $74 million to support him. Now, what about Vice President Biden? He got a later start. Obviously, he has not been, like the president, running for re-election for almost 4 years. He just semi-recently got the nomination. So Vice President Biden has raised $274 million, and outside groups have raised almost $137 million on his behalf. Now, these figures will constantly be updated, which means that Vice President Biden is not that far behind President Trump when it comes to the candidate committee. And the outside groups are supporting Vice President Biden at about a 2-to-1 ratio, which is something I really want you to think about when you hear about money in politics, which is how much are the outside groups, meaning these political action committees, spending to support or oppose a certain candidate. So let's compare this to the 2016 election cycle. There we have then candidate Trump, who raised about $333 million. Compare that to Secretary of State Clinton, who raised almost $564 million. So that means that Clinton raised over $230 million more than President Trump. What about the outside groups? Again, we see a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of Democrats. Outside groups spent about $100 million in favor of President Trump, spent about $206 million in favor of Secretary of State Clinton. So what do we take all of this to mean? Well, in part, again, look at how much the outside groups are spending. Sometimes they're filling a gap that the candidate committees themselves can't spend and can't raise. And look at how much the candidates are raising. So again, 2016, obviously President Trump wins. He spends about $333 million. Clinton spends a lot more than that, $564 million. Does that mean that money doesn't matter in politics, that money doesn't determine the winner? I think that's not true for a couple of reasons. One is that think about what a different candidate President Trump was. He was a candidate who had access to the media. So all of the things that a candidate would normally have to pay to get the voters' attention, President Trump was able to get that basically for free. That's called earned media or free media. So he was on Sunday talk shows so often, calling in, appearing, radio shows, cable news, network news. He basically was able to use the media in ways that other people would have had to pay for that type of exposure. And so I don't think that the 2016 election indicates that money no longer determines the winner. I think it means when you have a candidate who has access to TV cameras and microphones, that the normal rules don't necessarily apply. So let's talk a little bit more broadly, not just about the presidential campaign, but about how much money recently is being spent in federal campaigns, period. So, and again, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? We say there's a lot of money in politics, but there's a lot of people who live in America. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this question. In the 2016 election, candidates, parties, political action committees, other outside groups spent approximately $6.4 billion. The presidential election, all of the candidates, not just the two who gained the nomination of their parties, but all the candidates raised and spent about $2.4 billion. The other $4 billion went to congressional races, people who are running in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And what about these so-called PACs, the political action committees? They spent over $600 million. Again, about a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of Clinton and against President Trump. Now, how do these numbers compare to the 2012 election when President Obama was running against Mitt Romney? Well, it's about on par. In 2012, there was about $6.2 billion that was spent. But if you account for inflation, we actually spent a little less in 2016 than we did in 2012. Again, what could account for that? In part, you had just a different type of candidate, President Trump, who did not have to spend as much money to get the eyes and the ears of voters. What he was able to do, again, was call into shows, gain a lot of media attention just by showing up, just by appearing. He was able to get what most candidates have to pay for, and that reduced not only his costs, but the overall costs. Now, let's put $6.4 billion in context. What could we do with that? We could pay for all of the health-related costs of ozone pollution being higher than national standards for a year. We could give every public school teacher a $2,000 raise, travel to and walk on the moon 9 times, buy cereal for every American for a year. So $6.4 billion still gets us a lot of things. Now, how does this compare to not just what happened in 2016 and 2012, but way back in 2000? The cost of campaigns has almost doubled. In that case, about $3 billion was spent. So we want to talk a little bit about why so much more money is being spent over just a 20-year period. So back to, is it a problem? We've talked about the fact $6.4 billion or in the 2016 election, $6.2 billion in the 2012 election. We've said that's a lot of money, but there are a lot of people who live in our country. So maybe it's appropriate that we spend a lot of money. Now, there are about 330 million people who live in the US, a little more than 235 million, or a little more than 3/4 are 18 or over, meaning they're voting age. So let's talk about what percentage of the population actually is part of the campaign finance system, meaning what part of the population actually gives money or spends money in elections. First, what percentage of the total population do we think gives $200 to up to $200 to a candidate, party, political action committee, or another outside group? Of the total population, 0.53%. Of the adult population, 0.68%. Now, let's go up a little higher. What percentage of the population gave over $2,700 to a candidate, to a party, to a political action committee, to another outside group? Why did I use $2,700? That used to be the contribution limit threshold. And I'll talk about that in a minute, meaning the limit of how much you can directly give to a federal candidate. 0.08% of the total population gave $2,700 or more. 0.1% of the adult population gave $2,700 or more. And we have about 23 donors that spent $10 million or more. So let's say that one more time. Of the total population who gave $200 or more, 0.53%. Of the adult population who gave $200 or more, 0.68%. Of the total population who gave $2,700 or more, 0.08%. Of the adult population who gave $2,700 or more, 0.1%. So what does this mean? When we're talking about giving and spending money in politics, a very, very small percentage of Americans are actually taking part in that campaign finance system. Now, again, we have to ask, is that a problem? So we might say, well, that's good because I don't want to spend money in politics and it's really expensive to run for office. So I'm glad that other people are doing it. But again, let's think about that for a second. What does it mean? It means that there is a so-called donor class, a class of people in America. They're largely the ones funding campaigns. Now, what does this mean? It means that our candidates, just rationally speaking, are going to be more responsive to that group because that donor class helps them get elected and reelected. It's only logical to think that elected officials and candidates up and down the government, from local to state to federal, have to be mindful of the fact that there's a group that helps them get and keep their jobs. So this donor class has outsized influence. They have a lot of power because at the very least, the candidates are going to be responsive to their needs, are going to understand what they care about. This is why, for instance, we might talk more about pensions than student loans, because who is the donor class? Donor class is older, whiter, meaning less diverse, and better educated, and wealthier than the quote unquote average American, the average member of the electorate. So we've created a system, let's do it again. We've created a system, a situation, tried to combine those two words, where we have a small sliver of the population that's providing most of the funding for candidates. And what that means is that group has a lot of power over the national agenda. They have power over who becomes a competitive candidate because raising and spending money is really largely a proxy in cases for competitiveness. They have a lot of power over what those candidates talk about because they want to hear the candidates say certain things, and maybe even which bills are introduced and which laws are passed. So again, this donor class is has an enormous influence over our politics, our elections, and the shape of our country. So there's the problem as I see it. And let's even go a little bit deeper. Campaign finance law seeks to do a couple of things largely built on trying to reduce the influence of money in politics and trying to reduce the influence of large donors. So let's talk about those specifically. What are the purposes behind campaign finance laws? They can reduce corruption or the appearance of corruption. So if we have a situation where there are very large donors and we perceive that they can determine what our elected officials do or don't do, that looks like a bribery-like, not bribery, but bribery-like, or quid pro quo, meaning this for that relationship. And even the appearance of that, the Supreme Court has acknowledged, is harmful, because if you think that your government doesn't really work for you, that it works more for just high-priced donors, then that leads to the erosion of trust in government. It harms our idea of self-government, and we'll stop taking part in our government. We'll start voting. It just, in so many ways, harms our representative democracy. And so the court has recognized that maybe we should try and reduce actual corruption for sure, but even the appearance of corruption. What else do campaign finance laws try and do? They try and equalize the ability of all citizens to affect outcomes of elections, meaning it's not just the donors, the big donors, who can determine who runs, who wins, what they talk about. It's all constituents, because donors play a much smaller role. It means that elected officials talk to everybody, regardless of whether or not they can give money in elections. So that's kind of the donor side. It reduces the influence of donors. What about the candidate side? It also means that we could get different candidates. We don't just have candidates who are good fundraisers. We don't just have candidates who are good at talking to donors. We also have candidates who can appeal to people whether or not they can or want to give money in campaigns. We have candidates who can run who might not have a pre-existing network of financial support. We have candidates who don't have to spend so much of their time fundraising. We have candidates who can talk, again, to all constituents, not just to large donors. And what the Supreme Court has said is basically, yeah, we only really care about one of those purposes. We care about reducing corruption or the appearance of corruption. We don't really care about equalization. We don't really care about reducing the skyrocketing costs of campaigns. Let me stop here and say, what specifically are we talking about when we're saying campaign finance laws? We're talking about contribution limits, how much I can give to you if you're running for office. We'll limit that amount. We're talking about expenditure limits, how much money you can spend if you're running for office, you or a political party or a political action committee or an independent group. We're limiting how much you can spend. We're talking about disclosure provisions, which I'm not going to focus on today, but basically tell us where the money comes from. And we're talking about public financing programs where you can get some money from the government to run for office. And I'm not going to focus on those today either. But that's really what we're going to focus on with respect to campaign finance law, which is limits on how much you can give, contribution limits, and limits on how much you can spend, expenditure limits. So it was not that long ago that we really didn't have limits. We really didn't have campaign finance limits in our country. But what happens, Watergate, which I'm sure you've all heard of, the scandal that ultimately brings down President Nixon and leads to his resignation, is largely a campaign finance scandal. So in the wake of Watergate, Congress amends and really bolsters and passes the nation's first comprehensive campaign finance law. And again, what does that law do on the federal level? It limits how much candidates, outside groups, political parties can receive, meaning it limits contribution limits. It creates contribution limits, and it also limits how much all of those groups can spend. So if you're running for president, let's say, I'll just pull a number, you can only spend $50 million. You can't spend any more than that. Now, what does that mean? It means campaigns would be totally, totally different, because if you're limited in how much you can spend, then you're almost by definition, you don't have to fundraise endlessly, because you get the maximum amount of money, you raise your 50 million, and that's it. After that, you're no longer fundraising, you're just campaigning. Think of how incredibly different our elections would be on every level of government if at a certain point, our candidates just stopped raising money because they'd already raised the maximum amount that they could spend. Now, here's a story about what often happens in the law. There's a scandal. It's the Watergate scandal that we just talked about that brings down President Nixon. There's a law that's passed. People always say Congress doesn't really act. Congress is mired in inaction. Congress does act often when there's been a scandal. So again, Congress enacts the nation's first comprehensive campaign finance scheme. And then what happens? Somebody sues and the law goes to court. So in 1976, Senator Buckley goes to the Supreme Court of the United States and says campaign finance laws are not legal. And this is the biggest decision in campaign finance law. And what the court, I won't go into the full details of everything that the court said is, but what the court did is they said a couple of really important things. First, they said, whenever you give and spend money in elections, you're doing a version of speaking. When I give you money, I'm saying I support you. When you're spending money, you're actually engaged in political speech. And so once the court says that spending and giving money is the equivalent of speech, then anytime you try and limit giving and spending money, you have to make sure that that is constitutional under the First Amendment. Because we know that the First Amendment says, don't abridge the right of the freedom of speech. So this makes it very, very hard to implement campaign finance restrictions. What the court says in this 1976 case that's called Buckley versus Vallejo is that governments, state government, the federal government, in this case it's the federal government, can limit how much we give to candidates, how much we give to political parties, to outside groups. So contribution limits are okay because a contribution is just kind of speechy. It's not direct speech. And a limit on contributions reduces what we talked about before, corruption or the appearance of corruption. But the court said that expenditure limits on how much you can spend, are not constitutional under the First Amendment. So none of those can survive. The court strikes those down. So candidates can spend unlimited sums. Outside groups can spend unlimited sums. Political parties, political action committees, nobody is limited in how much they can spend because those laws are seen as an assault on the freedom of speech. So this decision fundamentally changes what could have been a completely different way to run elections and therefore to run our government. So that is largely the system that we have today. Contribution limits are okay. Expenditure limits are not okay. Now, really quickly, I'm going to fast forward to a decision that you've probably heard about. If you've heard about the Supreme Court and money in politics, you've probably heard about the Citizens United decision. This is a 2010 decision by the United States Supreme Court. And what they say is, if money is speech, then everybody has the same right to spend money in elections. And that everybody means actual people and also corporations. So what the court says is it doesn't matter if it's a corporation spending the money, it doesn't matter if it's a natural person spending the money. As long as money is speech, then the identity of the speaker doesn't make a difference. And so we can't limit how much money these corporations can spend to elect or defeat candidates. In this case, in Citizens United, the court wasn't talking about how much money corporations could give to a candidate, but how much they can spend independent of a candidate, meaning they don't talk to the candidate about the ad, they just spend the money. And what the second thing the court said is, so first thing is, it doesn't matter who the speaker is, it can be a corporation or it can be an individual. Second thing the court said is, when you spend money independent of a candidate, it can't be corrupting. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Let's say I'm running for city council and there's a corporation that really wants to make sure I'm elected. I never talk to them about their ad buys, but they spend $50 million on my behalf. What the court said is, because we didn't coordinate, that there's no way that spending, there's no way that independent expenditure by the corporation can possibly be corrupting. So those are the two important things from the Citizens United case in 2010. What does it mean? It means we have our current system. Back to the beginning, $6.4 billion spent. It's probably only going to go up from here. And so we have a system where the Supreme Court is whittling away at campaign finance restrictions. You might think that's great, but what it has certainly led to is an explosion of spending and an explosion of giving and spending, again, by that small sliver of the population. Now, that was campaign finance law in just a few minutes. Normally, I would spend about 25 hours in a seminar on it, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I want to now talk about really briefly is kind of where we're going. So we know what our current campaign finance system is. It's a system where we have some limits on contributions, no limits on expenditures, including expenditures that are by corporations. And so we really are flooded with money from a small sliver of the population. Now, but campaigns are changing. If I were going to ask you, where do you get your campaign finance information? My suspicion is it's not on television and it's not on radio, which are the most expensive places where you can buy campaign ads. It's online. So as your group starts shifting into being a bigger and bigger voting bloc, people are going to change how they're spending campaign money. And they will move again to Facebook ads, to Twitter ads, to whatever it is in 10 years for the online websites and social media platforms where you get your information. And so part of the question is, how much you can spend matter when you are getting more of your information online and maybe ignoring those political ads? So obviously in a social media platform, you're seeing things that are not being paid for, and then you're seeing the ads. Right now, things are shifting towards the ads. And so the question, it's a two-part question really. How much is it going to affect the fact that we're moving more money to online, paid online ads? And then two, how much will those ads matter if it's not quite like a television ad and maybe you can kind of click around it? So these are the really big unanswered questions in campaign finance law. Your generation will determine it because you will determine basically campaign advertising consumption practices. So I just want to flag for you, things are and will be changing. We're moving away from television and radio ads towards online ads. And we don't know how much that will basically change how much it costs to run for election. One more thing I wanted to talk about is campaign disinformation or misinformation. So we all are kind of, I think, have almost accepted that we will hear lies in campaigns, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not just talking about a situation where there are misleading statements by the candidates or by members of their campaigns or by outside groups. What we're talking about here is more of like a deep fake, a video that's posted online and it's made to look like it's Joe Biden saying something, but it's just created out of full cloth and it's not Joe Biden. He never said those words. Or it's a group of, let's say, trolls by a foreign government or a foreign group, and they're just propagating lies and falsehoods on a social media platform, and those lies and falsehoods start to go viral. Now, there's so many iterations of this that I could talk about. Again, the deep fakes, the troll farms, again, pushing out information that's not just a little misleading, but blatant lies, blatant fabrications. And this is happening mostly online. Now, the short answer is that we're still in the very beginning of this new behavior, and the law has not caught up. So lawmakers, judges have not caught up with how much behavior is changing, which means that we don't really have good laws in place to protect against this. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with you, the voters, having to take a very critical eye to what you see, not just what's paid content, but what's unpaid content. what people are sharing, the articles people are sharing on Facebook. So the current situation is you have a great deal of responsibility to determine whether or not you're going to give credence to the campaign advertisements and campaign articles that you see online. You have to take a very searching and almost pessimistic view and say, what's the source? Is it a biased source? You know, what exactly went on here? And it's almost incumbent upon voters to become fact checkers at this point. I wish I had something better to say other than we all at this point really need to be very active, very alert, take a searching eye to everything we read about the campaign. And again, really look at what's the source of the information and do they have a reason to be less than honest? So that is a quick tour of campaign finance and campaign disinformation. There's much more to say. I look forward to hopefully seeing many of you throughout the election cycle, probably on Zoom. And I wish you all, whenever you see this, a good morning, afternoon, or evening. Thanks.